I think for Ukraine, it's been one long journey in trying to expose Russian vulnerabilities and demonstrate that Russia is not invincible. That was the narrative in the beginning. That was the narrative for a large part of this war. It's been the narrative actually until recently. I think here in 2026, we've seen a change very much fueled by the fact that the trend is also different now on the front line. We see Ukraine actually taking back a bit of territory. So the pattern where Russia has always been able to progress has been reversed. And so in that sense, I do think that Ukraine is demonstrating that Russia is weaker than many people thought. And this is important because Russia has managed to build up this idea that Russia always wins its wars. And I think this is a narrative that's also been very prevalent in the West, that, okay, Ukraine is doing a good fight, but in the end, Russia is obviously going to win because they are bigger and Russia always wins. So for Ukraine to actually manage to get to a point now where I think we see them with self-confidence suddenly asserting themselves, and there is actually now, at least here where I live in Denmark, more talk in the news about how Russian oil refineries are burning than about how Ukraine is being hit, right? So there's really been a dramatic shift in the way these topics are discussed. Russia has several problems when it comes to air defense. One of them is the size of the country. It's just a lot to protect, but also we've seen Ukraine going deliberately after air defense systems for quite a while, which has laid the groundwork of what we see now and how it seems that Ukraine is able to strike pretty much every night something somewhere in Russia. So it has been a long process of hitting the Russian air defense systems to a point when these Ukrainian missiles and drones can actually get across the border. And it now seems that this is working. In combination with the fact that Ukraine is producing more drones, they can just launch a bigger number. That means that we are seeing a significantly higher success rate. At this point, we've come to a point where we see every day Ukraine striking something significant. I mean, it's hard to keep track of all the successful attacks. I think the strikes on the ports around St. Petersburg, which happened some weeks ago, were really significant. But also other strikes, we've seen them hitting Yekaterinburg, which is very, very far from Ukraine, right? So we see them really striking deep inside of Russia. We saw them trying in Kursk with the land offensive and grabbing territory like that. But since then, it's mostly been using the drones and missiles and the deep strikes to get that effect. And actually, most recently, what we've seen is Ukraine also focusing a lot on not those very, very long range strikes, but also those kind of middle range strikes, and trying to just hit the Russian positions, the Russian logistics, sort of in the more tactical space closer to the front line, in that range, maybe between 50 and 300 kilometers. So this is the kind of range where not that long ago, we were talking about how Ukraine needed the American ATACMS missiles or something like that, so they would have this capability of striking at these ranges. But now they have their own systems and have quite a lot of success with it. So I think this is really one of the big trends to follow right now, the fact that Ukraine is reaching parity and maybe even getting the upper hand in the air war in both long distance, but also closer to the front line. I think the strategy is to hit the Russian economy until a point when they can't continue the war anymore. And that process of hitting the war economy might translate into fractures in the Russian society, but ultimately that would be a Russian choice. That would be up to Putin to decide whether he would rather end the war and accept defeat, or he will sort of gamble and take the population into a bigger war, or to take new measures, such as broader mobilization in the Russian society. And if he does that, if he decides to continue the war despite the war economy being unsustainable, then that is something that can lead to fractures in the Russian society. But ultimately, it's a Russian choice, and Ukraine's goal is merely to bring Putin to the point where he has to make that choice. Putin is increasingly concerned about both the state of the economy and also about where the war is going. But that being said, I think it's going to take quite a lot before Putin really sort of internalizes the idea that Russia is not winning. This is a basic assumption that he's had throughout this, that in the end Russia will win. And I think ultimately that is still where we are at, that he acknowledges these setbacks, he acknowledges that things are tough, but that in the end, he still seems to believe that it's worth continuing the fight because Russia is winning. And that actually is a dangerous trajectory, because that means that he will make those choices that are more dangerous and can lead to worse consequences both for Ukraine, or also for Russia itself, or for the broader region, for the potential of broader escalation. I think, unfortunately, we are sort of following a track where this that the fact that Putin doesn't really acknowledge that this war is unsustainable means that he's taking the war further and further down a path where he has to constantly escalate and do something new and dramatic in order to try to change the heading. And this unfortunately means that we are looking into probably the most tumultuous period of the whole war, and actually that the end game of the war is also the part that could be the most dangerous and have the biggest potential for broader escalation. Putin does not want to lose the war, so that's the most important thing here. For Putin, winning the war is absolutely essential, and the idea of not winning the war is just unacceptable. But with Ukraine's strikes on the Russian economy, with their increased success on the front line, Putin is being pushed into making difficult choices, right? And essentially he's being pushed down a path where I would say there are three sort of fundamental questions or ways he could go. He could either accept that this is a defeat, they're not going to achieve their goals, right? So that would be accept losing the war. That doesn't seem likely. The other one is to try to escalate this into a broader war that mobilizes the entirety of the Russian population in a different way than it has done so far. We have to remember, in Russia, it's still the special military operation where they are not all in terms of mobilizing the entire society. The problem about that is that that can lead to problems inside of Russia that could lead to fractures in the Russian society, and Putin is not confident that he actually has the Russian people with him in such a project. So that would be the sort of second choice. And the third one, I'd say, is that he could try to more directly engage with Western European countries. So that would be the EU countries, it would be the United Kingdom, etc., to try to push us to stop supporting Ukraine, right? Because ultimately we are Putin's biggest problem here. If we did not support Ukraine, he would win the war, right? So but we continue supporting Ukraine, and that's why he's on this path towards defeat. NATO is in a very weak position right now because there is the political uncertainty about alliance cohesion. We don't know really where we have the United States. I think most people today probably assume that we cannot fully rely on the security guarantees of the United States. And that would mean the European countries would need to be prepared to deal with a Russian aggression. And I don't know exactly where we have all the European countries, right? It's quite possible that some of the European countries would not be prepared to actually fulfill their commitments either, especially if you don't have the support of the United States. Are we really prepared to declare war on Russia if we don't have the United States in on our side, right? So that's I think it's an open question. I hope the answer is that NATO would be ready, but I think the biggest uh, the biggest question is about the willingness, the determination of Western European countries. It's not about capabilities, because if we wanted to, sure, we have the capabilities that are needed to defeat Russia. Western Europe is in a much stronger position than Ukraine was in 4 years ago, right? Just in terms of our economic resources, the combined military power. So we of course we have what it would take to actually engage in a war with Russia, but do we have the political determination to stand together? I think that's the open question. Putin's biggest problem is the economy, which is really bad because of the war. So these things are connected. As long as the war continues, the Russian war economy is going to deteriorate. Everything is going to get worse and worse and worse in Russia as long as the war continues. And the only way to make that stop is to end the war. So that is really Putin's biggest problem, that things are bad with the economy. It's not certain where this is going to lead. What can the outcome be of an economic crash, for example, which is it's not impossible that we are going to see an economic crash in Russia. So how is he going to manage that while also being determined to continue the war? That's really the biggest headache right now that he has. I don't think we should be particularly, or I don't think Putin would be particularly concerned about the oligarchs, for example. Like the elite in Russia is quite under control because they all depend on him for their position. But the fact that the overall structure of the Russian society is not built for this war that they've engaged in, that's problematic, because that can have unforeseen consequences. Attrition is already limiting what the Russians can do. We have seen the Russian army not being able to grow within the last 3-4 months, where they have not been able to recruit as many soldiers as they've lost. So there's been a net decline. We see the Russians being almost unable to make progress on the front line. This is a combination both of attrition, but also Ukraine getting more drones. So it's more and more difficult to make any kind of progress. It takes more and more soldiers to be able to take the next kilometer. We are already seeing attrition really starting to bite. It's difficult to see how they are going to solve that problem with the current manning system they have, where it's voluntary recruitment in exchange for very large bonuses. People get big sign-up bonuses in Russia for going to war. But not enough people are willing to do that anymore, and they can't keep on raising the amount that people will get for that because they don't have the money for that. So I think we are approaching a point where Putin would need to change to a different kind of manning system with more forced mobilization in order to get the soldiers that he needs. So that is a consequence of attrition. That's already playing out. The Strait of Hormuz is an interesting problem because Ukraine has offered their assistance with some of the problems that Middle Eastern countries are facing with Iranian drones, and they are offering their expertise and their technology for how to beat the Shahed drones, for example. But the problem with the Strait of Hormuz is that Ukraine's counter-drone technology might not be sufficient in that area to do it, right? But what we're seeing in the Strait of Hormuz is a kind of asymmetric warfare, really, where the Iranians are using the same kinds of tools that Ukraine very successfully is using in the Black Sea. So the Russian Navy is really struggling there with Ukraine's unmanned systems, the maritime drones, the aerial drones, but it's the same kinds of systems that are at play here in the Strait of Hormuz. And I don't think that Ukraine really has the technology to solve that problem in the maritime space the same way that they begin to have on land. So I'm skeptical that Ukraine has the technology to really chip in with solutions about the Strait of Hormuz. But they do have technology that is very helpful in other aspects of this war with Iran. I think it's possible that this war can end in some kind of situation that means that Putin loses the grip on Russia. It's absolutely possible that this could end up in a kind of coup or revolution scenario. I'm not saying that's necessarily going to happen, but it's possible that that's where it will lead. And the more determined Putin is to continue fighting, despite this clearly not being sustainable for the Russian war economy, the more likely this scenario becomes. I do think it's something we need to be prepared for, that this can happen. And also if if turmoil breaks out inside of Russia, what is Putin going to do in that situation, right? He might not lose power right away, so he might be sitting there in the Kremlin getting more and more desperate and asking himself, what am I going to do about it? And one of the things he might do is to do something dramatic to sort of escalate his way out of the situation. So I think we need to be prepared for that. But I think it's absolutely crucial that we don't rule out that possibility, because this a war is definitely undermining his legitimacy, and he has committed so much to it that it's difficult to see him sort of get out in a meaningful way. One thing I will say that's been really interesting is over the last month, increasingly we are actually seeing in Russia people started talking about how some of the signs in the Russian society start looking like what led to 1917 and the Russian Revolution there. And they are talking about how it's necessary to prevent that from happening again. And this is not just sort of fringe groups. This is something that we've seen commentators on TV, we've seen politicians suddenly started talking about how this is comparable to 1917. I think that's quite significant that we see suddenly that kind of rhetoric being used inside of Russia, and it shows that there is a nervousness about what this can look like. I mean, we have to remember that what led to 1917 was the First World War. So that was also a war that broke the Russian war economy, or that led to that revolution. And it's not impossible that it could happen again.